Recall that in our last lecture module, we shifted our focus towards vagueness, using the example of chairs to illustrate how for many concepts, as we move farther and farther away from the core, central, or prototypical instances of that concept, as we start to lose a commonality of features, form, or function, the less clearly applicable those concepts become. As we move along this gradient, objects become less and less typical when judged in light of the concept. Typicality tells us that concepts have inherent vagueness. This vagueness can prove problematic in some circumstances, but overall, it allows us a certain flexibility in how we categorize the world. In this lecture module, we'll turn our attention towards ambiguity. In the case of ambiguity, what we'll note is that concepts are a management strategy for dealing with ambiguity. Concepts introduce a certain kind of ambiguity, and concepts also diminish a certain kind of ambiguity. Concepts try to strike a balance between these two types of ambiguity in order to facilitate high-functioning cognition. When we contemplate the task of categorization and bear in mind that we engage in categorization with limited knowledge and resources, we realize that categorization proves inherently ambiguous for two reasons. First, the world is inherently ambiguous in that objects are ambiguous with respect to our categories. Consider this watermelon. We could categorize it as a fruit, as a bit of plant matter, as an oval, as something that's green, as something that weighs more than 5 pounds, as a summertime food, as something that people have dropped off of buildings, and so on. There are lots and lots and lots of different categories, and nothing about this watermelon intrinsically favors one category over another. Thus, when we engage in active categorization, we are in effect taking a very ambiguous world and imposing a lower degree of ambiguity upon it, selecting a particular way of thinking about that object, packaging it up in a certain way. Once we have packaged up our watermelon that way, then we have access to the executive summary, to that set of information that has been culled from experiences because it has proved useful in interacting with objects of that category in the past. However, that access comes at a price. Once we categorize our watermelon as a piece of fruit and stop thinking about it as an individual object, we stop paying attention to its individuality, the ways in which it's the same or different from other pieces of fruit. We start to ignore those individual features of that specific watermelon and consider the watermelon as something generically fruity. This gives us access to all sorts of information, like the fact that the watermelon is edible. So we engage in categorization and thereby decrease the ambiguity of the world by packaging up bits of the world in accordance with particular categorizations amongst a wide array of possible, potential, applicable categorizations. That process provides access to information that is couched in that category, but that information then introduces a different kind of ambiguity. We no longer think about the watermelon, individual specific watermelon. We are thinking about it as a piece of fruit, and we don't differentiate between it and other fruits. Hence, it is now ambiguous in relation to all other instances of fruit. As a result, we can see that categorization is an ambiguity management strategy. Categorization decreases unhelpful ambiguity, providing us with access to generalized knowledge for a class of things. And that's the benefit. That benefit, however, has a cost. Categorization causes the loss of immediate access to information encoded under other equally applicable concepts, as well as a loss of specific information with regard to that specific object. So we have an increase in intraconceptual ambiguity, and we also seal ourselves off from other information conduits, other categorizations that can serve as portholes through which we can access other potentially useful information about the object differently categorized. Once we think of this specific watermelon as a piece of fruit, for example, we don't think about it as, say, something that will accelerate if dropped at a rate of 9.8 meters per second. That information is walled off from us, at least to some degree, so long as we continue to think about the watermelon in terms of our fruit category. We have executed this trade-off, and the cost for gaining this manageable amount of generalized, reliable, and relevant fruit information is the loss of the individuality with which we think about that watermelon. Increased intraconceptual ambiguity. Likewise, once we categorize something, that categorization provides our conduit into our knowledge base. Let's summarize that and put it into perspective. The trade-off between the loss of individual detail and increasing ambiguity intra-conceptually purchases the gain of generalized knowledge, decreasing ambiguity extra-conceptually. This trade-off drives categorization, and this trade-off makes sense given human inference and decision-making needs. Decreasing individual detail helps the brain to manage the huge volume of sensory information rushing in every moment of every day, and thereby increases speed and diminishes resource strain. Moreover, reasoners can recover individual information perceptually, oftentimes with relative ease, by reattending to that specific object again. In a similar fashion, cognizers can access related categorizations should they make an inapt categorization. And if worse comes to worse, they can always go back and recategorize. Likewise, categorization allows the cognizers to access information about objects that goes beyond their immediate experience, and thereby gives them an added edge in their adaptive interactions with objects of those kind in the distal environment.